I spent about 2 weeks traveling around Germany for the Euros, and while I was technically alone, I never felt lonely. There were so many fellow Scotland fans around that it was easy to make connections. It became second nature to trust the older Scots who'd buy me drinks and chat about where they were from, who they knew, and other typical Scottish banter. I felt safe, maybe too safe, and I guess that's where I made my mistake. That last night in Stuttgart started like any other. I was alone, but it didn't take long before a group of older men or women would notice me and ask who I was with. When they found out I was traveling solo, they'd tell me how brave I was to be a good-looking lassie on my own. They'd then invite me into their group, and soon enough I'd be drinking, celebrating, and that night, commiserating with them after Scotland's loss. Determined to make the most of my last night, I said my goodbyes to the friends I'd made, put on a short white dress draped in my Scotland flag, and set out to find a good spot to drink and dance. I met a few people along the way, but it was when I was alone that I encountered him. He approached me with a friendly comment about my oversized bag, and his words felt like the typical, light-hearted interaction I'd had many times before. He quickly shifted the conversation to where my supposed boyfriend was, and I played along, making a joke about still deciding between a German or Scottish one. This kind of banter was normal, leading to an offer to join a group for drinks. When he suggested going to a nearby Irish pub where his family was, I accepted without much thought. As we walked, he showered me with compliments, going on about how brave and incredible I was for traveling alone. He even made a show of it, telling passers-by about my supposed bravery. While it felt over the top, I didn't see it as anything more than the usual over-enthusiastic friendliness I'd encountered before. But then, as the conversation progressed, his tone shifted. He started asking about where I was staying that night and hinted that there might be room in their hotel if I needed it. That was when he mentioned something unsettling, how he wouldn't force himself on me. It was a jarring statement, completely unexpected, and it made me stop in my tracks. For the first time, I really looked at him. He was older, short but stocky, with wrinkles and white hair peeking out from under his Scotland cap. He tried to brush it off, saying he understood why I'd be cautious, but the comment hung in the air like a dark cloud. I forced a nervous laugh, but suddenly I felt cold and sober. My mind started racing, trying to take in my surroundings more carefully. The streets were still busy, but the crowd was thinning out as we moved further away from the main area. I asked where his family was, trying to keep my voice steady, and he pointed up the hill saying we were close. But then his conversation took an even darker turn. He began to recount his experiences in the military, casually mentioning how many people he had killed. He described one incident in a vegetable field and then went on to list the countries where he had taken lives. The words seemed to pour out of him without any sense of remorse or hesitation. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My family had roots in Ireland, and his mention of killings there hit me like a punch to the gut. He kept talking, describing more deaths in different places, but I was only half listening. My mind was focused on finding a way out. I started making eye contact with anyone who passed by, hoping someone would notice that something was wrong. But the street was getting quieter, and the people around us were fewer and farther between. As he continued talking, he suddenly asked why I seemed tense. He claimed to be able to read me like a book, and said he was doing all of this to protect me. He insisted that I didn't realize how much danger I was in. His words sent a chill down my spine, and I knew I had to get away from him. Just then I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a young man smiling at me, recognizing my Scotland flag. He asked me something about Scotland, but I didn't really hear him. My mind was too focused on getting away. I asked him where I could find food, hoping it would give me an excuse to leave. He pointed back down the hill, saying there was a place nearby. I turned back to the older man, who now had a blank, emotionless expression on his face. It was like he was looking straight through me. Another shiver ran down my spine as I told him I was going to get something to eat and that I'd meet him later. His demeanor shifted again, and he tried to convince me to stay, mentioning something about a rave he was playing at. I forced another smile and promised I'd catch up later, hoping he wouldn't press further. His expression went blank once more, but this time he turned and walked away without another word. I didn't stick around to watch him leave. I kept my head down and started walking, letting my feet guide me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to put distance between us. I don't remember how I made it to the train station or how I eventually reached my hostel. My mind was in a fog, but the only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to get as far away from that man as possible. There were no Irish pubs in Stuttgart, at least not in the direction we had been heading. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, but by then, all I could think about was how close I had come to something truly terrifying. It was during my trip through the Balkans. I was backpacking on a tight budget, which meant I had to forego comfort more often than not. I was in Thessaloniki, Greece, and had decided to take the midnight train to Athens to save on accommodation costs. Thessaloniki was a pleasant city, bustling and scenic, but the train station was located in a less appealing part of town. I had checked out of my hostel in the morning and spent the day exploring the city. By afternoon, I found myself in the area around the train station. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to the city center, full of litter, graffiti, and people who looked out of place. The train station itself was no better, a dingy place with a small, semi-open coffee shop. I stayed in that coffee shop as long as I could before it closed at 8 p.m. As I was sipping my drink and looking at my phone, a man burst into the shop. He was dressed in what appeared to be a military uniform, though something about it seemed off. He scanned the room hurriedly, his eyes darting around as if searching for someone. He saw me but didn't acknowledge me. Instead, he went up to the counter, speaking loudly in Greek. When the coffee shop closed, I went outside. The area around the station was eerily quiet, with a few people loitering who didn't seem to be waiting for a train. I wandered over to the tracks to familiarize myself with the area, only to see a train pull in. A group of middle-aged men rushed to the platform but didn't board or greet anyone. They simply walked up and down the tracks until the train left. There were no women or children among them. I returned to the waiting area and took a seat on a bench. I plugged in my earphones but kept the volume off, wanting to stay alert. Shortly after, the man in the military uniform appeared and sat next to me. He commented on a tattoo I had on my forearm, recognizing it from the movie Up. I was surprised he spoke to me in English, despite my Hungarian flag on my backpack indicating I wasn't Greek. We started talking about tattoos, movies, and travel. The conversation seemed normal at first, but when I mentioned my plans to visit Macedonia, his demeanor shifted. He became agitated and started discussing Greek politics and the relationship with Macedonia. His behavior was unsettling. There was something not quite right about him. He kept checking his bag, which seemed to contain a long, possibly heavy object, perhaps a weapon. I wasn't sure if it was standard for Greek soldiers to carry their weapons off duty, but it was unusual to see in Europe. He asked about my travel plans and whether I was staying in Athens alone. I answered honestly, telling him I was traveling alone and planned to catch a ferry soon. He offered for me to stay at his place for free, but I declined. He repeated the offer several times. Each time I refused. As we walked to the tracks when the announcement for the Athens train came on, he stopped at the luggage storage. He struggled to pull out a large old suitcase and slammed the storage door loudly. The noise was jarring, drawing the attention of everyone around us. He then told me he needed to use the restroom and asked me to wait for him with his suitcase. It was strange that he would trust a stranger with his belongings, especially given his odd behavior. I debated leaving the suitcase and catching my train, fearing that it might be a bomb or that I might miss my train. Despite my worries, I waited a few minutes for him to return. When he did show up, He asked again if I wanted to stay with him in Athens, and I declined once more. We went to the tracks and the train arrived. He insisted on sitting next to me, but I told him I had a seat reservation and was tired. He said he would ask the train staff if I could switch seats. He left his suitcase next to me again and went to find an employee. This time I didn't stay put. I boarded the train and quickly found my reserved seat. A few minutes later, a normal-looking man sat next to me. The soldier didn't come looking for me, and I never saw him again. Not even in the Athens station, where there were even more people. Looking back, I'm still haunted by that encounter. Was the man truly a soldier, just eccentric? Or was he someone pretending to be a soldier with darker intentions? It's a question that still lingers in my mind. A few years ago, I was backpacking alone in France and decided to take a day trip to Versailles from Paris. The trip required 2 separate train rides to get there and back. I remember getting on my first train for the return journey with my phone nearly dead, so I had it on airplane mode and low power. I had my headphones in, not playing anything, just to discourage anyone from talking to me. That didn't stop a guy named Mark. He came over and sat beside me, speaking in French. I was exhausted from walking around the gardens all day and wasn't in the mood to engage, so I pretended not to understand French. Mark pulled out his phone and used Google Translate to ask if I wanted to learn French. I said no thanks, and tried to make it clear through my body language that I wasn't interested. Still, he kept going, asking through his phone where I was staying. I lied and said I was in a big hotel with my family in Paris and was heading back to them. He wanted to know the hotel's location, but all I said was Paris. Then he asked if I was getting off at a certain stop, and I said yes, which was another lie. He mentioned he'd get off at that same stop with me. I immediately said no and ended the conversation. I put my headphones back in and shut myself off from him, which made him leave me alone for a few minutes. But then he took a phone call and said to his friend, "Yeah, I'll get off at Gare du Nord, and you go to Gare de Lyon." My alarm bells went off because Gare de Lyon was where I was actually getting off. When we reached the transfer station, Mark got up and waited for me at the train doors. I deliberately took my time getting ready to leave the train, making it obvious I was stalling. He eventually left to catch the other train while I took my time getting off and moving to the next train. I boarded the train at the very front and kept a close watch on everyone around me, making sure no one seemed suspicious. When we reached Gare du Nord, I scanned the platform and the people disembarking, but Mark and his friends were nowhere in sight. We continued to Gare de Lyon, and as soon as the train arrived, I got off with the crowd. I turned a corner, and there he was, with 4 friends, scanning everyone coming out of the station. I immediately turned around and went in the opposite direction, quickly changing my appearance by letting my hair down from its bun. Once I got out of the train station, I ran back to my hostel and didn't leave it unless one of my roommates was with me. It was August 2012, and I was 20 years old, enduring my junior year of college while my boyfriend Ryan was living and working in Trieste, Italy. We both came from New England, making our relationship a long-distance one that stretched over 10 months. My parents, recognizing the difficulty of this separation, gifted me a plane ticket for a visit during Ryan's February break, which conveniently fell on his birthday and Valentine's Day. Everything seemed ideal. When the time came, I was at the airport sending a final text to Ryan to say goodbye and wish him a happy birthday before boarding my flight. I knew I'd be out of touch for the duration of the trip, and upon landing, due to work commitments, Ryan couldn't meet me at the airport, so he had sent me instructions for navigating Trieste. The directions were straightforward. After landing, go outside to the bus area, take the C bus for about 45 minutes, and it would lead me to a train station where Ryan would meet me. He also suggested getting a map or asking someone for directions if necessary, but assured me that following his instructions should work. Despite the clarity of these directions, unease began to set in as I sat on the bus. It's remarkable how isolation in an unfamiliar place can stir anxiety, particularly when one lacks language skills and familiar support. To alleviate my worries, I decided to seek assistance from the woman sitting next to me. The woman acknowledged her limited English skills and seemed to understand when I pointed to the train station on my map. She appeared to be willing to help, which gave me a sense of relief, as she had seen my destination on the map. However, the situation took a disturbing turn about 15 to 20 minutes into the ride. The bus stopped in a neglected area that bore no resemblance to the train station I had anticipated. The woman stood up and motioned for me to follow her. The surroundings outside did not align with the expected location, and I had not yet traveled the full duration Ryan had mentioned. The woman's insistence grew, and she tried to physically pull me from my seat. A surge of alarm washed over me as I realized that something was amiss. My instinct was to stay on the bus, despite her growing irritation. As she left muttering something in Italian, I noticed 5 men stand up from different parts of the bus and exit with her. They had been seated separately and had not interacted with her during the ride. This sudden and coordinated movement among them was deeply unsettling. The situation felt orchestrated, and the possibility of a setup was frighteningly real. After the incident, I arrived at my stop without further complications. When recounting the experience to Ryan, we both laughed it off, comparing it to a scene from a movie like Taken. Despite our laughter, the incident remained troubling. Trieste, like many regions, had issues with human trafficking, and just months earlier, a major trafficking ring had been dismantled in the area. The thought that I might have been targeted by a group using a woman to lure me, followed by others attempting to force me off the bus, felt all too plausible. Reflecting on the experience, I am thankful for my decision to stay on the bus. It was a harrowing situation that heightened my awareness of the risks associated with solo travel, especially in foreign countries. The encounter left me relieved to have avoided a potentially dire outcome. I had just landed at JFK after a grueling 24-hour journey from Asia. It was almost midnight, and I was desperate to get home. My exhaustion made every minute feel longer as I joined the long line for a cab, trying to stay awake. While I waited, a man caught my eye. His clothes were dirty and worn, and he had a look that made me shiver. He spoke to me in Mandarin with a thick, almost threatening accent. I turned to him, my heart beginning to race. He asked where I was going. I told him the general area, hoping he'd leave me alone. But he said he could take me and pointed to a car parked a short distance away. The car looked old and run down, and he had no luggage. Something about him made me very uneasy. A chill ran through me. When he reached for my bags, I felt a wave of fear. I quickly pulled my bags away and took a step back, my heart pounding. The man's smile turned creepy, his eyes cold and focused on me. He moved closer, his hand still reaching out. Panicking, I shouted, "I don't want it," in both Mandarin and English. My voice was shaky, and I backed away, gripping my bags tightly. The man's smile faded into a scowl, but he didn't try to grab me again. He turned and got into the car, which was driven by someone else. The car roared to life and sped off into the night. I stood there shaking, trying to catch my breath. I texted a friend, telling her what happened. My hands were still trembling as I watched the car disappear into the darkness. The encounter left me feeling scared and vulnerable, a stark reminder of how dangerous a situation can become.